Most people who report alien contact are immediately measured against a single question. What do they have to gain? For the majority, the answer is uncomfortable. Attention, book sales, a place in a community they were previously excluded from, a story that makes them interesting. But what do you do when the witness has everything to lose? Phillip Krapf was a career editor at the Los Angeles Times, a man whose entire professional life had been built on one thing above all others: skepticism, the systematic application of doubt to every claim, every source, every story that crossed his desk. A man whose job was to ask hard questions and reject anything that did not hold up under scrutiny. In 1997, that man reported being taken aboard an alien craft and held for 3 days. He came back with a story he spent considerable time wrestling with before deciding he had no choice but to tell it. And when he told it, he wrote it the only way he knew how, with the precision, the observational detail, and the measured restraint of someone who had spent decades separating fact from fiction for a living. This is the Phillip Krapf case. And the question it raises is one that no simple explanation has ever satisfactorily answered. Why would a man like this make something like this up? Phillip Krapf was not a peripheral figure in American journalism. He had spent his career at one of the most respected newspapers in the United States, working as an editor at the Los Angeles Times at a time when the paper was considered among the finest in the country. His professional background was built entirely on the rigorous evaluation of information. He understood better than most people exactly what constituted a credible source, a verifiable claim, and a story that would survive the scrutiny of editors, lawyers, and a skeptical readership. He was also, by every account, a man with no prior interest in UFOs or extraterrestrial contact. He had not been following the contactee literature. He had not attended conferences or immersed himself in the subject. He was an ordinary man in the most professionally extraordinary sense, someone whose entire working identity was defined by the rejection of unsubstantiated claims. In 1997, all of that changed in a single night. Krapf reported waking in the early hours of the morning to find himself being taken, not violently, not with the paralysis and terror that characterized so many abduction accounts. The process was calm and deliberate and gave him the distinct impression that whoever was responsible for it had done this before and knew exactly what they were doing. He found himself aboard a craft. The interior was unlike anything he had a reference point for, but he described it with the specific and grounded observational style of someone trained to notice and record detail accurately. The space was large, functional, and clearly the product of a technology operating on principles entirely outside his existing knowledge. The beings present were not the small gray figures of the standard abduction literature. They were taller, more physically varied, and carried themselves with the ease of people operating in an environment they were entirely comfortable in. They told him their name for themselves, the Verdens. The Verdens, as they presented themselves to Krapf across the 3 days he was aboard the craft, were not a newly arrived or recently discovered civilization. They described themselves as ancient, beyond any scale of time that human history offered a meaningful comparison for. Their development as a species and a civilization had proceeded across timescales that made human, recorded history look like a brief footnote. They had long since moved past the kind of conflict, scarcity, and existential threat that defined so much of human experience, and had reached a level of social and technological development that Krapf struggled to find adequate language for. They showed him their society, not through simple description, but through what he understood to be direct experience, exposure to their culture, their values, their way of organizing collective life across a civilization of extraordinary scale and age. Krapf absorbed this with the trained attention of someone accustomed to evaluating complex information quickly and accurately, and he described what he had been shown with a specificity and coherence that set his account apart from many contactee narratives of the period. He was taken through what he understood to be space, The journey gave him a direct and physically experienced sense of distances and scales that no amount of reading or viewing could have produced. He was not simply told that the universe was vast. He was shown it in a way that left a permanent impression on a man who had previously approached the cosmos with the polite intellectual interest of an educated layperson, rather than any deep personal engagement. The central and most significant element of what the Verdens communicated to Krapf was not simply informational. It was purposeful. They told him he had been selected, not randomly, not because he happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or because some aspect of his biology made him useful for research purposes. He had been chosen specifically and deliberately because of what he did and what he was. A professional journalist with decades of experience at one of America's leading newspapers. Someone with the skills to observe accurately, describe precisely, evaluate critically, and communicate clearly to a mass audience. They told him that the time had come to begin preparing humanity for the knowledge of their existence, that a process of gradual and careful disclosure was being planned, and that it required human participants with specific capabilities to serve as intermediaries between the Verdants and the broader human population. Krapf had been identified as one of those participants because his professional background made him uniquely qualified for the role they had in mind. He was not simply a witness. He was not simply a subject of study. He was being recruited. The weight of that proposition sat heavily on a man whose professional instincts immediately generated every objection a trained journalist would produce. He interrogated what he had experienced. He questioned the reliability of his own perceptions. He examined the possibility that what had happened to him had a conventional explanation that he was failing to identify. He did all the things his career had trained him to do when confronted with an extraordinary claim. And he kept arriving at the same place. Something had happened. He had been somewhere. He had been told something. And he had been asked to do something with it. The book Krapf eventually wrote was titled The Contact Has Begun, published in 1998. It reads differently from almost every other contact or abduction account in the literature. The voice is measured and self-aware. The observations are precise without being dramatic. The author's own skepticism is present throughout, not as a performance of credibility, but as a genuine and active force in the narrative. A trained mind continuously examining its own experiences and findings, and refusing to present conclusions it cannot support. He described the Verdens society with the organized clarity of someone writing a long-form feature rather than a memoir of personal revelation. He addressed the obvious objections to his account directly and without defensiveness. He acknowledged the professional risk he was taking by publishing under his own name and by staking his credibility on a story that every professional instinct he had developed over decades told him would be difficult to defend. He published it anyway, because his equally strong professional instinct toward accuracy and honesty gave him no other option he could live with. The credibility of the Krapf case rests on a foundation that is unusual in the contact literature and worth examining carefully. Most contactee accounts ask you to evaluate the witness against a background of ordinariness. An ordinary person reporting an extraordinary experience. The question is always whether the ordinary person is reliable, stable, truthful, and free from the motivations that might produce a fabricated account. Krapf presents a different challenge entirely. He was not an ordinary person in the relevant sense. He was a professional whose entire career had been dedicated to the systematic rejection of unreliable claims. The skills he brought to evaluating information were not amateur or informal. They were the product of decades of professional practice at one of the most demanding journalistic institutions in America. To fabricate an account of the kind he published would have required him to violate every professional value he had spent his career embodying. It would have required him to produce and stand behind a story he knew could not be verified from a man in a profession that regarded unverifiable stories as failures. The professional cost of fabrication for Phillip Krapf was not simply reputational embarrassment. It was the destruction of everything his working life had been built on. Researchers who examined the case found this dimension of it genuinely difficult to account for through any conventional explanation. People fabricate for reasons. The reasons that typically apply to contactee accounts, attention, community, commercial gain, simply did not map onto the profile of a career Los Angeles Times editor with nothing to prove and a great deal to protect. The Phillip Krapf case does not resolve cleanly. No physical evidence was produced. No independent witnesses confirmed the 3-day absence or the experience itself. The Verdens have not announced themselves to the world in the way that Krapf was told they eventually would. What remains is a book written with the voice of a man telling the truth to the best of his considerable ability. A professional record of an experience that a professional had every reason not to report and reported anyway. And a question that sits at the center of the case, like a splinter that cannot be removed. If Phillip Krapf was lying, what exactly was he lying for? Nobody has produced a satisfying answer to that question in the decades since The Contact Has Begun was published. And until they do, the case of a Los Angeles Times editor who spent 3 days with the Verdens remains exactly what it has always been, unexplained. If this case pulled you in, subscribe, because we cover stories exactly like this every single week. Drop a comment below and tell me what you find most compelling about the Krapf case. Is it his journalistic background? The 3 days aboard the craft? The fact that the Verdens chose him specifically because of his professional skills? Let me know below.